My favorite number is 7. 7-11. Welcome back to the Sleepless Tales reading of the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. We're starting halfway through chapter 2. We're on page 41 of my copy. I don't have much to say. Don't forget to like, comment, favorite, and subscribe, and let's hop into the reading. Oh, on the first half of this, Gregor is still a bug. What's happened? The sister started feeding him. It's been like a month now. He's just kind of complaining about his life. As one will, to being a bug and so on. Well, let's get started. Okay. Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon realized. While during the day, Gregor, out of consideration for his parents, did not want to show himself by the window. He couldn't crawl around very much on the few square meters of the floor. He found it difficult to bear lying quietly during the night, and soon eating no longer gave him the slightest pleasure. So for diversion, he acquired the habit of crawling back and forth across the walls and ceiling. He is especially fond of hanging from the ceiling. The experience was quite different from lying on the floor. It was easier to breathe. A slight vibration went through his body, and in the midst of the almost happy amusement which Gregor found up there, it could happen that, to his own surprise, he let go and hit the floor. However, now he naturally controlled his body quite differently, and he did not injure himself in such a great fall. His sister noticed immediately the new amusement which Gregor had found for himself, for as he crept around, he left behind here and there traces of his sticky stuff, and so she got the idea of making Gregor's creeping around as easy as possible, and thus of removing the furniture which got in the way, especially the chest of drawers and the writing desk. But she was in no position to do this by herself. She did not dare to ask her father for help, and the servant girl would certainly not have assisted her. For although this girl, about 16 years old, had courageously remained since the dismissal of the previous cook, she had begged for the privilege of being allowed to stay permanently confined to the kitchen, and of having to open the door only in answer to a special summons. Thus, his sister had no other choice but to involve his mother while his father was absent. His mother approached Gregor's room with cries of exulted joy, but she fell silent at the door. Of course, his sister first checked whether everything in the room was in order, and only then did she let his mother walk in. In great haste, Gregor had drawn the sheet down even further and wrinkled it more. The whole thing really looked just like a coverlet thrown carelessly over a couch. On this occasion, Gregor held back from spying out under the sheet. Thus, he refrained from looking at his mother this time, and was just happy that she had come. "Come on, he's not visible," said his sister, and evidently led his mother by the hand. Now Gregor listened to the two weak women shifted the still heavy old chest of drawers from its position. And, as his sister constantly took off herself the greatest part of the work, without listening to the warnings of the mother, who was afraid that she would strain herself. The work lasted a long time. After about a quarter of an hour had already gone by, his mother said that it would be better if they left the chest of drawers where it was, because, in the first place, it was too heavy. They would not have finished before his father's arrival, and, with the chest of drawers in the middle of the room, it would block all of Gregor's pathways. But in the second place, it might not be certain that Gregor would be pleased with the removal of the furniture. To her, the reverse seemed to be true. The sight of the empty walls pierced her right to the heart. And why should Gregor not feel the same, since he had been accustomed to the room furnishings for a long time, and an empty room would thus feel himself quite abandoned? And is it not the case, his mother concluded very quietly, almost whispering, as if she wished to prevent Gregor, whose exact location she really didn't know, from hearing even the sound of her voice, for she was convinced that he did not understand her words. And isn't it a fact that by removing the furniture, we're showing that we're giving up all hope of an improvement, and are leaving him to his own resources without any consideration? I think it would be best if we tried to keep the room exactly in the condition in which it was before, so that, when Gregor returns to us, he finds everything unchanged, and can forget the intervening time all the more easily. As he heard his mother's words, Gregor realized that the lack of all immediate human contact, together with the monotonous life surrounded by the family over the course of these 2 months, must have confused his understanding. Because otherwise, he couldn't explain it to himself that he in all seriousness could have been so keen to have his room emptied. Was he really eager to let the warm room, comfortably furnished with pieces he had inherited, be turned into a cavern in which he would, of course, then be able to crawl about in all directions without disturbance, but at the same time, with a quick and complete forgetting of his human past as well? Was he then at the point already on the verge of forgetting that it was only the voice of his mother, which he had not heard in a long time? That had aroused him. Nothing was to be removed. Everything must remain. In his condition, he couldn't function without the beneficial influences of his furniture, and if the furniture prevented him from carrying out his senseless crawling about all over the place, then there was no harm in that, but rather a great benefit. But his sister unfortunately thought otherwise. She had grown accustomed, certainly not without justification, so far as the discussion of matters concerning Gregor was concerned, to act as a special expert with respect to their parents. And so now, the mother's advice was for his sister sufficient reason to insist on the removal. Not only of the chest of drawers and the writing desk, which were the only items she had thought about at first, but also of all the furniture, with the exception of the indispensable couch. Of course, it was not only childish defiance, and her very recent unexpected and hard-won self-confidence which led her to this demand. She had also casually observed that Gregor needed a great deal of room to creep about. The furniture, on the other hand, as far as one could see, was not of the slightest use. But perhaps the enthusiastic sensibility of a young woman of her age also played a role. This feeling sought release at every opportunity, and with it, greed now felt empty to want to make Gregor's situation even more terrifying, so that then she would be able to do even more for him than now. For surely no one except Greed would ever trust themselves to enter a room in which Gregor ruled the empty walls all by himself. And so she did not let herself be dissuaded from her decision by her mother, who in this room seemed uncertain of herself in her sheer agitation and soon kept quiet, helping his sister with all her energy to get the chest of drawers out of the room. Now, Gregor could still do without the chest of drawers, if need be, but the writing desk really had to stay, and scarcely had the woman left the room with the chest of drawers, groaning as they pushed it, when Gregor stuck his head out from under the sofa to take a look, how he could intervene cautiously and with as much consideration as possible. But unfortunately, it was his mother who came back into the room first, while Greed had wrapped her arms around the chest of drawers in the next room and was rocking it back and forth by herself, without moving it from its position. His mother was not at all used to the sight of Gregor. He could have made her ill. And so, frightened, Gregor scurried backwards right to the other end of the sofa. But he could no longer prevent the sheets from moving forward a little. And that was enough to catch his mother's attention. She came to a halt, stood still for a moment, and then went back to Greet. Although Gregor kept repeating to himself over and over that really nothing unusual was going on, that only a few pieces of furniture had been rearranged, he soon had to admit to himself that the movements of the woman to and fro, their quiet conversations, the scratching of the furniture on the floor affected him like a great swollen commotion on all sides, and so firmly was he pulling in his head and legs and pressing his body to the floor, he had to tell himself unequivocally that he wouldn't be able to endure all this much longer. They were cleaning out his room, taking away everything from him he cherished. They had already dragged out the chest of drawers in which the fret and saw and other tools were kept, and they were now loosening the writing desk, which was fixed tight to the floor. The desk on which he, as a business student, a school student, indeed, even as an elementary school student, had written out his assignments. At that moment, he really didn't have any more time to check the good intentions of these two women, whose existence he had in any case almost forgotten, because, in their exhaustion, they were working almost silently, and the heavy stumbling of their feet was the only sound to be heard. And so, he scuttled out. The women were just propping themselves up to the writing desk in the next room or other to take a breather, changing the direction of his path 4 times. He really didn't know what he should rescue first. Then he saw hanging conspicuously on the wall, which was otherwise already empty, the picture of the woman dressed in nothing but fur. He quickly scurried up over it and pressed himself against the glass that held it in place, and which made his hot abdomen feel good. At least this picture, which Gregor at the moment completely concealed, surely no one would now take away. He twisted his head towards the door of the living room to observe the women as they came back in. They had not allowed themselves very much rest and were coming back right away. Greet had placed her arm around her mother and held her tightly. "So what shall we take now?" said Greet, and she looked around her, and then her glance crossed with Gregor's from the wall. She kept her composure only because her mother was there. She bent her face towards her mother in order to prevent her from looking around, and said, although in a trembling voice and too quickly, "Come, wouldn't it be better to go back to the living room for just another moment?" Greet's purpose was clear to Gregor. She wanted to bring his mother to a safe place and then chase him down from the wall. Well, let her just attempt that. He squatted on his picture and did not hand it over. He would sooner spring into Greet's face. But Greet's words had immediately made the mother very uneasy. She walked to the side, caught sight of the enormous brown splotch on the flowered wallpaper, and before she became truly aware of what she was looking at was Gregor. She screamed out in a high-pitched, raw voice, "Oh God! No God!" and fell with outstretched arms, as if she was surrendering everything down onto the couch, and lay there motionless. "Gregor, you!" cried out his sister with a raised fist and an urgent glare. Since his transformation, those were the first words which she had directed right at him. She ran into the room next door to bring some spirits, or rather, something which could revive her mother from her fainting spell. Gregor wanted to help as well. There was time enough to save the picture, but he was stuck fast on the glass and had to tear himself loose forcefully. Then he also scurried into the next room, as if he could give his sister some advice, as in earlier times. But then he had to stand there idly behind her, while she rummaged about among various small bottles. Still, she was frightened when she turned around. A bottle fell onto the floor and shattered. A splinter of glass wounded Gregor in the face. Some corrosive medicine or other dripped over him. Now, without lingering any longer, Greet took as many small bottles as she could hold and ran with them to her mother. She slammed the door shut with her foot. Gregor was now shut off from his mother, who was perhaps near death, thanks to him. He could not open the door, and he did not want to chase away his sister, who had to remain with her mother. At this point, he had nothing to do but wait, and overwhelmed with self-reproach and worry, he began to creep and crawl over everything, the walls, furniture, ceiling. Finally, in his despair, as the entire room started to spin around him, he fell into the middle of the large table. A short time elapsed, and Gregor lay there limply. All around was still, and perhaps that was a good sign. Then there was a ring at the door. The servant girl was naturally shut up in her kitchen, and Greet must therefore go to open the door. The father had arrived. "What's happened?" were his first words. Greet's appearance had told him everything. Greet replied with a dull voice. Evidently, she was pressing her face into her father's chest. "Mother fainted, but she's getting better now. Gregor is broken loose." "Yes, I've expected that," said his father. "I always told you that, but you women don't want to listen." It was clear to Gregor that his father had badly misunderstood Greet's short message, and was assuming that Gregor had committed some violent crime or other. Thus, Gregor now had to find his father to calm him down, for he had neither the time nor the opportunity to clarify things for him. And so he rushed away to the door of his room and pushed himself against it, so that his father could see right away as he entered from the hall that Gregor fully intended to return at once to his room. But it was not necessary to drive him back, but that one only needed to open the door and he would disappear immediately. But his father was not in the mood to observe such niceties. "Ah!" he yelled as soon as he entered, with a tone as if he were at once all angry and pleased. Gregor pulled his head back from the door and raised it in the direction of his father. He had not really pictured his father as he now stood there. Of course, what with his new style of creeping all around, he had in the past neglected to pay attention to what was going on with the rest of the apartment, as he had done before, and really should have grasped the fact that he would encounter different conditions. Nevertheless, was that still his father? Was that the same man who had lain exhausted and buried in bed in earlier days when Gregor was setting out on a business trip, who had received him on the evenings of his return in a sleeping gown in an armchair, and totally incapable of standing up, who had only lifted his arm as a sign of happiness, and who, in their rare strolls together on a few Sundays a year, and on the important holidays, made his way slowly forwards between Gregor and his mother, who themselves moved slowly, always a bit more slowly than them, bundled up in his old coat, all the time settling down into his walking stick carefully, and who, when he had something to say, always stood still and gathered his entourage around him. But now he was standing up really straight, dressed in a tight-fitting blue uniform with gold buttons, like the ones servants wear in a banking company. Above the high, stiff collar of his jacket, his firm double chin stuck out prominently. Beneath his bushy eyebrows, the glance of his black eyes was freshly penetrating and alert. His otherwise disheveled white hair was combed down into a carefully exact shining part. He threw his cap, on which a gold monogram, apparently the symbol of the bank, was affixed, in an arc across the entire room onto the sofa, and moved, throwing back the edge of the long coat of his uniform, with his hands in his trouser pockets, and with a grim face, right up to Gregor. He really didn't know what he had in mind, but he raised his foot uncommonly high anyways, and Gregor was astonished at the gigantic size of the sole of his boot. However, he did not linger on that point, for he knew from the first day of his life that as far as he was concerned, his father considered the greatest force the only appropriate response. And so he scurried away from his father, stopped when his father remained standing, and scampered forward again when his father merely stirred. In this way, they made their way around the room repeatedly, without anything decisive taking place. Indeed, because of the slow pace, it didn't look like a chase. Gregor remained on the floor for the time being, especially when he was afraid that his father could take a flight up onto the wall or the ceiling as an act of real malice. At any event, Gregor had to tell himself that he couldn't keep up this running around for a long time, because when even his father took a single step, he had to go through an enormous number of movements. Already he was starting to suffer from a shortage of breaths, just as in his earlier days. His lungs had been quite unreliable. As he now staggered around in this way, in order to gather all his energies for running, hardly keeping his eyes open, in his listlessness he had no notion at all of any escape other than by running, and had almost already forgotten that the walls were available to him, although they were obstructed by carefully carved furniture full of sharp points and spikes. At that moment, something or other was thrown casually, flew close down by, and rolled out in front of him. It was an apple. Immediately, a second one flew after it. Gregor stood still in fright. Further flight was useless, for his father had decided to bombard him. From the fruit bowl on the sideboard, his father had filled his pockets, and now, without for the moment taking accurate aim, was throwing apple after apple. These small red apples rolled as if electrified around the floor and collided with each other. A weakly thrown apple grazed Gregor's back, but skidded off harmlessly. However, another thrown immediately after that drove into Gregor's back really hard. Gregor wanted to drag himself off, as if the unexpected and incredible pain would go away if he changed his position, but he felt as if he was nailed in place and lay stretched out completely, confused in all of his senses. Only with his final glance did he notice how the door of his room was pulled open, and how, right in front of his sister, who was yelling, his mother ran out in her undergarments, for his sister had undressed her in order to give her some freedom to breathe in her fainting spell, and how his mother then ran up to his father. On the way, her tied-up skirts, one after the other, slipped towards the floor, and how, tripping over her skirts, she hurled himself onto his father, and throwing her arms around him in complete union with him. But at this moment, Gregor's powers of sight gave way, as her hands reached to the back of his father's head, and she begged him to spare Gregor's life. And that is the end of Chapter 2 of the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. I told you yesterday this would be a sort of short-ish one. Sort of short-ish. We'll continue on with the third chapter tomorrow, as per always, guys. As per always. Sleepless Tales, you know who it is. Like, subscribe, comment, favorite, like. Don't forget, gilded in the comments. 200 Reddit upvotes. Big money moves. I gotta say, guys, if you want to make a real difference in the world, Donate, people. Reddit Silver, Reddit Platinum. And you can't forget about that funny little seal that says Epic Win on Reddit.com. Let's make a real change, guys. Change your world, change your life. Anyways, have a great night. I want to say I love you, man. But nothing, actually. That's just facts. Good night.